Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Wyatt Claypool Show. There are a lot of conservatives out there who are feeling queasy about the Ontario provincial election. And quite frankly, it's because there's no real mainstream conservative option on the ballot, at least to most people's knowledge. When I look at the polls in Ontario right now, I am seeing a heavy amount of overlap between the regions and demographics that usually vote for Justin Trudeau's Liberal Party voting for Doug Ford's PCs because a lot of federal conservatives just sit out provincial elections now because they're effectively voting for Justin Trudeau's best political ally in Doug Ford. And then you have the Liberals and the NDP who are extremely disorganized, and you can't really say that much different about them compared to the Ford PCs. But that's why I really like to talk about and bring up the New Blue Party every time I talk about Ontario politics. And I am very happy to have on today somebody I find is one of my favorite people in Canadian politics, someone who's actually inspired me to do a lot in the political scene, and that is New Blue Party leader Jim Karahalios. I wanted to have him on today to discuss what's going on in Ontario, what options do people kind of have in this election, and why the landscape in Ontario is so different from every other province. Most provinces, we have conservative parties on the ballot. What's going on, Jim?
How are you, Wyatt? Good to talk to you again. Thanks for having me on, making the time.
Yeah, no, it's been a couple years, but I really wanted this to happen again. So it's great that we got, I guess I can thank Doug Ford for a snap election, or else I'd be waiting another year.
I can't believe it's been only 2 years because it went by in a flash. I mean, we had a ton of work. 2022 was our first election. I was sick when we started the party, so we got a late start, but we had about a year to get into that election, and we found 124 candidates step forward. We got them all on the ballot. On election day, we had 123. One had to back out because their employer pressured them. And at the end of the day, we finished with the fifth number highest votes in Ontario. Our showing was the most votes and the greatest vote share that any political party in an Ontario provincial party has had since 1934, which was the precursor to the NDP. And then, but the fallout from that election, we had all this mountain of paperwork. We had 124 riding associations, 124 candidates. So we had to do audits and financial returns for all those. So that's 248. And then there were 3 or 4 audits of the New Blue Party for the campaign period, for the year in general. That was 2 years in a row. We were just swallowed up in paperwork, and we worked really hard, a small team, to make sure that we didn't lose any ridings and that none of our candidates did not file or did not fail to file, so that that ensured that they could still run again in the next election. And that takes a lot of work because most of our candidates had never run before. And then we organized a grassroots policy conference that led to the first policy declaration for the New Blue Party, with ideas put forward by members and voted on at an in-person conference. And then next thing you know, Doug Ford's saying, let's have an early election. So the 2 years went by in a flash. And here we are with an unnecessary election in the middle of a couple of snowstorms in Ontario.
Yeah, and this isn't like a Jean Chrétien early election where it's like, 6 months before it's supposed to happen, throw people off balance. That's politics. It's maybe a smart maneuver to do, a little unethical. This is a year and a half early. And the whole purpose of the election, I think, has actually caused a lot of people just to disconnect because it was slated as being an election to protect Ontario from those nasty Americans. And now the trade war is canceled, and I don't even know what this whole thing's about. I attempted, and I did get through the whole thing, but it took me a few tries to watch the Northern Ontario debate between the 4 party leaders. And I was just left with feeling like nothing was said. And especially Doug Ford, he'll every once in a while use a conservative turn of phrase, but I never get the idea that the man is conservative. It's always that he brags about how much he ended up spending on a specific industry, how much money he transferred to a specific area. But I've never heard any tax cuts mentioned. But he'll say, well, I've never raised a tax. I'm not sure what you think about what was said in that debate, but maybe you could also mention how the New Blue Party is standing in this election, how many candidates you have, and how that process was as well.
Yeah, I mean, Doug Ford's calling an early election because he's hoping to get an extension on his mandate before Ontarians wake up and realize, Justin Trudeau's now resigned. Things are not looking better in Ontario. And pretty soon, Ontario voters are going to realize it's Doug Ford that was responsible for most of the pain they've been enduring for the last 6 years, the lack of economic production coming out of Ontario, the lagging economy, even post and pre-COVID, balloon spending, taxes. It's not true that Doug Ford has not raised taxes. He brought in an industrial carbon tax before the Supreme Court ruled, and we have two carbon taxes in Ontario now. We have the consumer one from Justin Trudeau, and we have Doug Ford's industrial carbon tax, and he created an entire carbon registry for industry to register their emissions. Very costly. That's another type of red tape that Doug Ford doesn't like to talk about. And of course, the Greens, the NDP, the Liberals are not going to talk about that stuff because they like it. So there's a bunch of issues that the media is not talking about because they don't want to cover the New Blue because the other three mainstream parties don't hold Doug Ford to account on it because they're largely in agreement with it. And so he called this early election. Thankfully, my wife Belinda, the former MPP of Cambridge, she's very diligent. She was all over the news sources and some of the insider Queen's Park reporting, and she made us well aware that we're going to go into an early election. I didn't really believe it, Wyatt. I thought they were just bluffing to get the Liberals to spend money. But we started taking in candidate applications. But unfortunately, a lot of people were thinking like me. They were thinking, Doug Ford's not really going to do an election a year and a half early in the middle of winter, maybe March, maybe April. And we come out of New Year's, and next thing you know, he's calling an election. And there was a bit of a scramble there, Wyatt. Like, we didn't think we were going to get more than 40 or 50 candidates, but a lot of people who were interested in running, they just wanted to make sure there was an actual election going on. And they finally started collecting the signatures. At the end of the day, it was a mad scramble. Those last 7 days, we had tough fights with returning officers on the ground that were working for Elections Ontario, but you'd think they were working for the establishment parties the way they were fighting our candidates to keep them off the ballot. But all 108 people that stepped forward and tried to get signatures and tried to file paperwork all got on the ballot. So in all the ridings we targeted, 108, we got candidates on the ballot. There's going to be 108 New Blue candidates. There's only 16 ridings where we did not have someone step forward. And the other good news is, of the 108, that makes up 96% of our vote from 2 years ago. So we're covering the vast majority, almost 100% of our voters from the last election. So and that was part strategy. We were really targeting our strongest ridings this time. And 108 candidates, a much better group than we had the first time. We have some candidates that are running a second time, and a lot of new ones. The first time around, we had a lot of candidates, Wyatt, that were looking at, what you would call a COVID election. And they were thinking, I can jump on this new party, kind of ride the wave and get elected. And now, and some of those candidates, they didn't win. So then they just left. They didn't do financial returns. They just abandoned the party. And it's going to be expected. You can't know everyone personally in a year and a half when you start a party. Now, this time around, I'm seeing from the 108 candidates are people who are committed, not just, to get elected to Queen's Park, but they're committed to moving the issues forward, holding the other parties accountable. And they know every vote we get is a vote to strengthen the New Blue Party, to create a proper, principled, true blue alternative that holds the PCs and the Liberals' feet to the fire. And they're looking at it long term in terms of a long-term vision to grow a party. And they know it's not going to be, a quick couple years to a majority. This is going to take a grind and a long process. And we got to keep taking steps, and eventually the dam will break and there'll be a tipping point.
I always liked the quote that you have from Rob Ford. I remember you mentioned it in an interview where you posted a clip of it. I think the interview only has like a few hundred views, and I must be like half those views, because I just really like the quote that you have from Rob Ford in the last couple of years of his life when you were his executive assistant in council in Toronto, right?
No. We just became friends. I was actually helping a candidate that was running for leader of the PCs, Monty McNaughton, and I was doing all of Monty's policy. He was campaigning against wind turbines, campaigning against the sex ed curriculum, if that sounds familiar.
Mhm.
And we went to a meeting with Rob Ford, and I asked Rob to endorse Monty, and he did. And then me and Rob became very good friends. And I kind of, he was asking me for how we're going to run the campaign with Monty, and when he should do interviews and speak out and stuff. So that's kind of the relationship. I never worked for Rob, but we
Oh,
became
fair
pretty
enough.
good friends till he passed away. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's because I heard you were just like working with him a lot. But the quote I really liked is that the way that you end up winning an election or you do politics is every single day you got to wake up and you got to pound the ball downfield. That it's not one of those things where you put your name on a ballot and you just run to victory in a short little sprint and that's all. Because you pointed out that Rob Ford, the first time he ever ran for council, came like third or fourth place, and it wasn't a particularly great third or fourth showing. It's like 10% or 12%, which is nothing to sneeze at, but it wasn't like he was a contender in who was going to win. And it's just that you have to go back and you got to keep talking to people, keep shaking hands, keep giving your message out, and eventually you will break through. And when you mention having a better slate of candidates in the second election rather than the first, I know that you're also not meaning that as an insult to people in the first slate. A lot of them are running for again this time. Some of the really good people from the first time just didn't have time the second time. But I did interact with some people who it felt like they wanted to be on the ballot because they thought they were going to easily win, and they also didn't want to do any work. But that's sort of one of those things that happens in a lot of small parties. But maybe to get to the whole crux of the election, especially how New Blue fits in, why shouldn't people give Doug Ford a third chance? Because I always hear that you can't vote New Blue because you're going to let the Liberals or the NDP win if you do that, even if you, although if you look at the polling, neither of those parties are positioned to win a government. It's either a Ford majority or Ford minority at this point. But why shouldn't we return Ford to a majority?
Yeah, that statement is one of the propaganda tools that the operatives of the PC party put out there, which is, as bad as Doug Ford and the PCs are, the Liberals will be worse. And it's repeated by some mainstream, social media influencers that state that as well. Wyatt, it's really unfortunate the breadth and the depth of people who repeat that type of propaganda. But I mean, I don't understand what that statement kind of is comparing, because you can always kind of dream up a scenario where government is worse than the current one you have. But if you're looking at track records, the Liberals and the PCs, it's not liberal light. It's an exact mirror image, the PCs and the Liberals. I mean, the Fraser Institute put out a study a few weeks ago, and I was shocked that the Fraser Institute was so aggressive, but they clearly stated Doug Ford and the PCs have outspent Kathleen Wynne. Belinda kind of blew the whistle on another on the social side, which is the Ford government is still investing in and promoting DEI initiatives in the education system and in other government sectors. So whether it's education, healthcare, social policy, fiscal policy, tax policy, they're the exact same extension of the McGuinty Wynne Liberals. And I don't think you get any more left wing than a Kathleen Wynne kind of figure. What Doug Ford does, and you mentioned Rob, he's not Rob Ford. He had the benefit of being Rob Ford's brother, and he's, uh, as completely different he is from Rob, he absorbs some of the rhetoric. So he's, Doug's kind of clever. He knows how to throw out a statement, a good rhetorical piece for word comeback to media that makes it sound like he's conservative. But when you look at his record behind the scenes, he's nothing like Rob. He's polar opposite. He likes to be a liberal. He wants to be a liberal. That's why he endorsed Christine Elliott in that leadership that Rob Ford endorsed Monty McNaughton. And his record is the same, if not worse, than the McGuinty Wynne Liberals. So what does that mean? It's not about electing a party to go in there and fix the mess. That's the eventual goal. But in the meantime, we need voters to vote for the New Blue, and we need to get out in front of voters to build a stronger party to continue to hold them to account. So you'll see different policies that we've championed And primarily, you know, before Belinda was elected, there was the Axe the Carbon Tax campaign. And then Belinda as an MPP, the first New Blue MPP, the type of policy she was advocating for. And we were really ahead of the curve in a lot of different aspects. You're looking at the Axe the Carbon Tax campaign. Obviously, that's pretty popular now in conservative circles. And then you're also looking at stuff like Belinda advocating against the drug injection site. Belinda being the only MPP to vote against critical race theory bill that the NDP put forward, that the PCs all voted in favor of. We started the Stop Woke campaign in Ontario that you can, is still online. There's a petition from our website. And all of these things, years later, you see governments backtracking. So you see the Ford government eventually 5 or 6 years later backtracking from drug injection sites. So they've clawed them back a bit. They're still funding a lot of them across Ontario. And when Belinda was in there, they looked at her like she had 4 eyeballs. Another example why it is Belinda held them to account at Queen's Park over a rising cost of electricity and wind turbines. Another issue was she stood up at Queen's Park, the only MPP, to say, when are you going to get tough on the border and the fentanyl that's pouring in from China that's, laced with other substances, making it lethal. And they kind of laughed at her and said, well, we're funding drug injection sites. Now you see Doug Ford and the federal Liberal government forced to do something about the border. And that's something that Belinda championed. So, yeah, Doug wants another election here to get a quote unquote mandate to spend more money than he did in COVID or the same amount of money. He didn't have that mandate for COVID. But if he had listened and if he was forward thinking, we probably wouldn't be in the mess we're in now, and we'd be ahead of the game with the Americans and have a better relationship with them, and we'd have better border security.
Well, it seemed like with the trade war, he almost invited it because he wanted an excuse to engage in COVID-style relief spending again, which is really just picking winners and losers in the economy, because that was the first thing he rolled out upon his announcement. We need COVID-style relief spending. But a great example of the sort of fake red meat, the impossible red meat that Doug Ford ends up putting out during election campaigns, but it's not backed up by his actual record, is him saying, well, we should bring back the death penalty, because he knows that's going to create a splash in the media and everyone's going to be like, oh, I can't believe Doug Ford would say that. And then conservatives around the province think, oh, was he actually on our side? No, like, look at his actual record on crime. I actually just, because I do a lot of crime research, I just happen to have the crime stats on my computer here for violent crime. In 2018, when he took office, the rate per 100,000 people of violent crime, and I always like to use violent crime because sometimes other types of crime change over time and the rate goes down, not because things are safer, it's just because, break and enters aren't as common when there's Ring doorbells everywhere. But violent crime incidents in 2018 were 904 per 100,000 people. They are in the year 2023, because we don't have the 24 numbers out, it's 1,055 per 100,000 people. The rate of violent crime has gone up a lot. And even rate isn't exactly, I think, the best measure, because crime happens in fixed geographic areas. It's not like it's the city has expanded by 10%. If the population expands, there is still a stabbing on that street corner. And so he hasn't used the OPP to crack down on violent crime or to pass any provincial laws to hold criminals longer. And he lets synagogues get shot up, and they're like, people in Jewish neighborhoods get harassed and Hindu temples get harassed by Khalistanis. You have all this nonsense going on, and he always just sits back and says, why won't Justin Trudeau do something? But he, as a man who can't even enforce the death penalty, is going to start talking about the death penalty.
He's the most powerful man in Ontario. That's what you get when you're the premier of Ontario. And he's failed on every issue. And he's failed on issues that conservatives are supposed to succeed at. They're supposed to succeed at crime. They're supposed to succeed at policies to bring tax relief, to measure and reduce the deficit and the debt burden. Succeeding on crime, meaning the crime rate and the rate of violent crime is supposed to come down under conservative governments through a variety of measures. And yes, criminal code is federal, but there's a lot of what Doug Ford can do pressuring the Trudeau government to do something about those things. And he doesn't, take the opportunity. He's really good at shooting from the hip sometimes in front of the media in a controlled environment where he has reporters that are friendly to him, asking him the question. He probably knows what some of those questions are going to be. But the record speaks for itself. And that's what we're here to do. We're here to remind Ontarians what the record actually is and not to fall for the rhetoric. And more and more people are realizing it. We had 127,000 people vote New Blue in 2022. Like I said, that was the highest number of votes for a party in their first election in Ontario since the 1930s, which is the precursor of the NDP.
That was even better than Reform did in 1988 with Preston Manning leading them.
In their first Ontario, like the first time they ran Ontario candidates, you mean, or in general?
Just in general, in the election overall, they only got 2.2% in that election.
Yeah, and they had the strength of the West, right? So we can't raise money from Conservatives out West because we're an Ontario party. And Reform had, the base of the West, so they were eventually able to crack into Ontario when you have a bunch of seats in the House of Commons federally from the West. It's easier to kind of build that profile. We are just Ontario. We're not a federal party. And I think we did well in that first election, considering, we got going about a year and a bit before. And we were kind of locked down for most of it. So there wasn't a lot of touring that could do. There wasn't, people were afraid to go meet people. And, we've got to keep building on that. And the great thing about the New Blue Party is the more Ontarians hear about it, the more they become open to it. And so there's two primary goals that we have, or challenges, I should say, that are goals. Number one, obviously, we need more Ontario voters to learn about the New Blue. An interesting thing happened last election. Wyatt, remember the day after voting, New Blue was trending on Twitter. That's because people were going to the ballot box, seeing this New Blue Party for the first time in every riding. And, whether they hated it or wanted to make fun of it or championed it or asked questions, all of a sudden they were on Twitter tweeting New Blue and intrigued. But a lot of, there are people that don't know about the New Blue because the mainstream media doesn't want to cover us. We don't get invited to leaders' debates. But then there are people that know about the New Blue and aren't maybe ready to give it a vote. And that's logical in the sense that the other parties have been around for 100 years, for the NDP, the Liberals, the NDP, the PC, sorry. And then you got the Greens that have been around for 60, 70 years. And that's like embedded in the mindset of a brand that is consistent. It's always going to be there. It's not a one-trick pony. People looking at the New Blue, they're going to need at least two, maybe 3, 4 elections to see New Blue repeatedly on the ballot and say, okay, this is not going away. This is a legit political party that's going to have candidates every election. And then you're going to see some of those votes move over, as opposed to just popping up the first time. Voting a different way, people take their vote very, very seriously. And voting a different way is not like changing, the cereal you're going to buy or the type of produce.
And people who voted for like Mike Harris's PC party back in the 90s, it's almost like that version of the PC party almost always leaves an impression for how they consider the party today, even if the party today really doesn't reflect any of Mike Harris's ideas of fiscal responsibility and social conservatism. But because it's almost like there's a lag where it takes a long time and a lot of bad decisions for people to finally realize these guys are like Kathleen Wynne's Liberals. I actually cannot see a difference. In fact, I like to bring this up because it's striking that obviously you guys would have called it out too, but Bonnie Crombie had to call out Doug Ford for putting the statue of John A. Macdonald on the grounds of Queen's Park in a wooden box. Like this is the
PCs Canadian... that are supposed to be for our history, and he doesn't care about history. The Mike Harris days, those were a long, long time ago, and a very different time. We're talking about decades now. And it's not possible to get a Mike Harris leader of the PCs now because, the logical thing would be to fight from within. That's the other piece of rhetoric the PC operatives do. You got to work from the inside, quote unquote, make a difference on the inside. Well, show me someone who's worked from the inside more than me in Ontario or Canadian politics. I don't think you're going to find someone who's fought harder on the inside of the establishment parties to make change. And the reality is when you get strong enough within a political party in the establishment parties to influence change, to win nominations, to win a president presidential election for party president, which I ran in, to win a leadership. What they do is either they rig the vote or they kick you out. And it's not like the US where the primaries are protected and, they can't just disqualify Donald Trump for no reason off the ballot. Here, a small committee of 3 or 4 people just decide you're not in the race and you're done.
That's what
and
there's no
rules, there's no law, there's no legal recourse for it. And the same when they rig an election. I ran for PC party president when Doug Ford was newly elected as premier. His team of lobbyists and hacks in the back, they didn't know how to campaign against me. They didn't know how to stop me. So they had a huge team. They had all the resources. They had the premier staff. They had PC party staff all working against me. At the end of the day, they had to stuff the ballots to stop me. So there's no working it on the inside. So what does this all mean? Because you might be hearing this for the first time thinking, this is pretty dire. Like, this is bad for Ontario. Well, there's a silver lining here. And the PCs, the Liberals, the NDP are all the same. But the good news is, if we do enough campaigning and the New Blue Party continues to grow as a force and we challenge them on some established narratives, what happens is, as soon as one of the parties adopts a position because the vast majority of Ontarians agree, for example, drug injection sites, Ontarians are turning against them. As soon as one of the parties moves, they all move. So as soon as you get the PCs to move on a carbon tax, you see Bonnie Crombie move on a carbon tax. As soon as you see PCs move on drug injection sites, you see left-wing mayors and the Liberals and the NDP, they basically stop advocating aggressively for drug injection sites. And none of that can happen if we don't have a strong New Blue Party holding their feet to the fire and bringing up those issues that none of them will ever bring up because they're cowards. And that's the most important reason to give the New Blue Party your vote on February 27th.
And I would fully encourage everyone watching this, if you live in Ontario, I would get a New Blue Party membership, sign up for their email list. Just keep in the loop with what they're doing. Obviously, vote for them in this provincial election if you have a New Blue candidate in your area. If you don't, you can probably just vote for some independent, that's there, or at least, don't put your ballot in. You guys, the only places you guys really didn't have candidates were in areas like Parkdale, Hyde Park, or somewhere like Spadina, where it was going to be pretty difficult to get somebody to run there anyways. And, it's a downtown Toronto riding. To bring this up, actually, because now you and I have both experienced insider political shenanigans of being kicked out of races and undermined and whatnot. Your wife even put forward a private members bill back when she was a PC MPP. She was still in the party. She put forward a private members bill to actually have Elections Ontario be able to prosecute people for rigging internal party nominations. Because obviously, it's not a private club at the end of the day, because this is picking somebody who is going to hold public office. And in most ridings, it's a safe seat, and whoever gets nominated is going to be the guy. And what did they do to that bill, if you can give me some background?
Yeah, so a lot of people don't know that in Ontario politics and Canadian politics, what we call nominations to pick a candidate out of a political party or internal party races to elect the party president, if someone stuffs the ballot in the general election, so February 27th, someone shows up to a polling station, grabs 3 ballots from the polling clerks, fills them out, puts them in the box, gets rowdy in a polling station, takes a box and runs away with it, or impersonates someone else. There's all laws in Ontario under the Elections Act that says it's illegal. You can't do that at a general election. We can get in a whole discussion as to how often they prosecute, but there have been cases in the past where people have received punishment and been prosecuted for violations of the Election Act, and a lot of that is on the financial side. But for internal party races, you're running for a party president, you're running an internal nomination. If someone does that, there's nothing. You can't do anything. You can't call police. You can't report them to Elections Ontario, because they'll all tell you there are no laws on the book against that. And that's stunning when my wife realized that as an MPP. And she did a very simple private members bill, which is just to say the exact same sections in the Elections Act that apply at general elections, they should apply to internal party elections. And wouldn't you know it, the PCs, who were under fire for 2 years when Patrick Brown was in charge, for having voter fraud in their internal party races, they refused to move it out of committee. They let it die in committee after second reading. They wouldn't bring it back. Really simple bill. Like, who's in favor of voter fraud? Everyone's against it.
Mhm.
99% of Ontarians are against voter fraud, except, maybe there's a cynical 1% that the lobbyists probably are for voter fraud so they can keep rigging their elections. But the other 99% of Ontarians are against it. And the PCs let the bill die on the paper.
And here's the thing, too, is that they could still, in theory, just appoint candidates if you're not allowed to rig a race. You can just appoint the candidate, but the problem is a lot of the establishment parties want the veneer that they're nominating people, that there was a vote that was held and someone was nominated, even though in some of these races that were happening under Patrick Brown, you would literally, I heard, have the lights turned off in the room so someone could grab a ballot box and run out, or they would just kick out the three actual serious challengers to their guy that they wanted, and then he runs against some nobody who was in the race for 5 seconds and he wins. Whoa, I couldn't believe that happened. And then you move on. But it sounds like to most people who are not party members and don't follow races particularly closely, oh, this guy won a nomination. And less than 1% of people most of the time have a membership for any federal or provincial party. That is counting all types of parties combined, probably even municipal parties in Vancouver. Less than 1% of Canadians, or just 1% of Canadians most years, have a membership. And there's multiple leadership races. It might be a little bit more, but you get my point. And that's the thing with the Doug Ford PC party. In 2022, in fact, I think most of their candidates were basically just acclaimed whenever they got a nomination challenger. If they got a nomination challenger, it wasn't Doug Ford's guy, got acclaimed immediately.
Yeah, there were no elections. The election stopped in the PC party after the 2018 convention. So in 2018, they came out of the general election. They won, and they rushed into a general election. I ran for party president. And Doug Ford and his staff, with the help of some fake social conservatives and fake pro-life groups, they wanted to put in place their red Tory guy who's been around for 50 years. And they rigged it to ensure that happened. And after that, I blew the whistle. I fought back. They've never had an election again. So all their candidates are just picked. And PC members would be appalled at the candidates that they're picking. They've got card-carrying liberals that are candidates for the PCs that become MPPs. Then they had another convention in 2020 to pick a new party president, and they just put in place a lobbyist. So there's no more elections, and that's a great example, Wyatt, of why the New Blue Party exists, because you can't fix that party from the inside.
Yeah, and that's good thing we actually addressed that, because I almost get driven up the wall. Yes, there are times when there are smaller parties that pop up, and it's just it's a purity party that they are pure on this issue and they think that the bigger party isn't doing a good enough job. That's fair enough. They can do that, but usually there's not really as good of a case to start the new party. In Ontario, it was a textbook example of the party insiders are never going to really let you make change. They're never going to actually change how they do things at all. And so you would be a fool to keep being tricked by people into just continue trying to make change from the inside. They'll just send you on some treadmill somewhere, just spinning your tires. Maybe they give you a couple of small victories here and there that don't really mean anything, and then you never go anywhere. Ontario, and so federally, I'd be voting for federal Conservatives. Ontario, I'd be voting New Blue, because I actually eventually need to vote for a party that is even in the orbit of my values, and the Ontario PC party is far away from it. That's why I've noticed, and again, going back to the polls a little bit, I noticed the same groups and demographics and regions that tend to disproportionately vote federal liberal are voting PC, because federal conservatives mostly just sit it out because they don't even know what this race is even about. They look at Doug Ford, who's just campaigning on the fact that I didn't raise any taxes, which you've already said is fake, and they're like, but that means we're still at the sky-high taxes that Kathleen Wynne posted. Taxes are by rate. It's not like it's a raw tax that he hasn't raised. People are still on the top marginal taxes, paying 58% of their taxes when you take into account federal, provincial, and property taxes. It's ridiculous. And so maybe if you could give me a rundown of the top five kind of big platform points of New Blue. I know you guys have a very extensive New Blueprint 2.0. People can go read on the website. I'll link that here. But what are sort of the things that if you know your elevator pitch of what New Blue stands for?
Yeah, I mean, number one, primarily, whether you're a federal Christian Heritage Party voter, PPC voter, Conservative Party of Canada voter, or, there's a lot of small c conservative voters who voted Liberal, believe it or not, because of the scandals that Stephen Harper was going through near the end of his term. The primary motivation for why you'd look at the New Blue Party is to hold government accountable and clean house at Queen's Park. And so people are getting tired of Ontario politics because it doesn't matter whether you got McGuinty, Wynne, Doug Ford, it's the same scandal after scandal at Queen's Park over and over and over again. And they want ethical change and they want people with integrity going in there. And in any riding across Ontario, if you're voting for the NDP candidate, the Liberal candidate, or the PC candidate, you're just going to get a mouthpiece for the party lobbyists that are running the show, not even for the party leader. It's the party lobbyists. So that's why you're seeing, I think, voter totals going down.
Yeah, it's like in 22 it was like I think 47% turnout.
Yeah,
Usually
the turnout was
never
really
go
low.
below 50%. I think the only times you go below 50% is like in World War II when nobody's home to vote.
Yeah, and so if you want a party that's going to clean house and take a hard look at why the system's kind of broken in Ontario politics and having accountable MPPs, it's the New Blue Party. If you want the same old nonsense, then you can vote for one of the other three parties, but no one should be surprised when they're going to get the same garbage that we've been getting for the last 20 years for 4 more years, if that's the case. Other policies that we have in place, there's really 2 pillars of the New Blueprint. Number one, we advocate for policies that put meritocracy first. And that means getting rid of initiatives like DEI initiatives. That means stopping all the woke activism in provincial government, whether it's in the education system, whether it's in healthcare. That means allowing choice in healthcare to make sure that you can go see a healthcare practitioner as quickly as I can take my dog to get to a veterinarian. And the choice in education is another example in providing tax relief for people that choose not to send their kids to a public school. And then on the fiscal side, the second pillar of the New Blueprint is to grow the economy and put permanent tax relief in place. Growing the economy starts with reducing electricity rates. The biggest driver in terms of driving our economy down for the last 20 years has been rising electricity rates and rising debt. And the electricity rates are only going to go down if we get rid of the wind turbines. And then with the growing economy, we got to do a massive tax relief because Doug Ford in 6 years now has not offered any tax relief other than a short, 2-month window or a few month window on cutting gas taxes, which he never made permanent. And then, I think there was a little break from the HST or whatever for a little bit.
And if the industrial carbon tax is put in place, it more than makes up for the small temporary reduction that you get in the gas tax. The funny thing is, the federal Liberals and PCs share ideas all the time. Ford's the one who did the $200 check idea first, and then Trudeau did the $250 check thing, the same sort of bloated plan that gives people back a little bit of their money for a massive bureaucratic expense. And then Doug Ford also did the short-lived gas tax cut to make himself temporarily popular. And Mark Carney and Justin Trudeau said, that's brilliant. We should cut the HST for 2 months and pretend that we're giving people real tax relief right before we hit them with an increase in the carbon tax in April. And you get your $250 Doug Ford inspired check too. And that's the thing, is that the government is just covered in subsidies right now in Ontario. I just saw a study from the Fraser Institute, to bring up the Fraser Institute again. It was about British Columbia, but it would map perfectly onto Ontario because the tax systems are similarly bloated in those two provinces. The top marginal tax rates, when you bring in all the surtaxes and whatnot, are sitting around 53%, provincial and federal combined. They said if the British Columbia government cut the top marginal tax rate from 20.5% down to 14%, they would only forego about $100 million in the first year. And then by the third year, they'd only be losing about 400 million in tax revenues. And for a province the size of British Columbia, that's not that big of an issue. That's a rounding error for their budget that's hundreds of billions. And so, like, you look at it, you're like, why not cut taxes? Doug Ford could do the same thing. And you'll know the Ontario's government does this kind of sleight of hand trick where its top marginal tax rate is only 13%, but then you pay taxes on top of your taxes in order to actually beef up their revenues, which is why the top marginal tax rate in reality in Ontario is 53%, because you start getting taxed 25% every dollar you give them over 5,000, and then once you hit 7,500 you have to pay them another 33% on every dollar above that. It's actually such a scam.
Yeah, and it's very disappointing that you have a what people thought they were getting a different government when Doug Ford came in power with the massive majority. Belinda was part of that, and there isn't tax relief that Doug Ford has seen that he likes. And a lot of the inflation we've seen in Ontario is because of his government policies, whether it's introducing new red tape, whether it's that carbon dioxide registry for emissions, CO2 emissions for industry that's costly, and industry just passes it down, whether it's wasting money on subsidies for electrical vehicle manufacturers that stick around for a year and then get up and leave anyways with, millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars of taxpayer money in their pocket, corporate welfare. Or whether it's the industrial carbon tax. This guy has raised taxes, in fact, and it's a slap in the face to give you $200 before an election. Unfortunately, a lot of Ontarians are slow to realize this because the media is covering for the Doug Ford PCs, and a lot of the left-wing policies they're putting in place are favored by the Liberals and the NDP, so they're not going to call Doug Ford out on that. That's why we need voters to vote New Blue and give New Blue a chance so we can continue to advocate, hold their feet to the fire, and challenge the left and change the course. That's what we've been doing for a long time, even before we started the New Blue Party. And the more we can push and the more support we have behind us, it becomes harder and harder for the establishment press and the establishment parties to ignore the support that we have and the ideas that we put down. And they're gonna jump to copy our policies. They're not going to be so slow in the future. And ultimately, that's what we want. We want eventually to win seats in Queen's Park. We want one day to be the government at Queen's Park. But in the meantime, we want to push the issues and continue to grow and become a force in Ontario politics where they can't ignore our positions on issues, and they have to adopt our issues, regardless of whether it's a PC government that's adopting them or another government. So I strongly urge people to talk to their neighbors. And if you want a clean house and at Queen's Park and make sure the lobbyists aren't the ones running government in Ontario forever, vote New Blue.
Mm-hmm. And here, I just want to bring up one thing, and then I have one final question for you in this interview. One, I do want to give a shout out to, I don't know their names, but several of my audience actually signed up to be New Blue candidates in this election. So I wish you guys all luck. But on the list of spending subsidies that you were mentioning, the thing I love to bring up right now, because so few people know it, is that cricket factory that produced crickets for human consumption was also subsidized by the Ontario government. There's a reason why Vic Fideli came out to do a grand speech where he named it as a success story in Ontario economic development. He's the Minister of Economic Development in Ontario. And one, guys, it's what I call fake jobs. If the taxpayer has to pay for the job to exist, it is a fake job, and that we should be celebrating it. But I noticed that so many conservative influencers and like organizations like Ontario Proud and Canada Proud, they like to make fun of Trudeau for funding it, but it's just, missing in action the fact that Ontario's government was celebrating it as much as whoever the economic development minister is from the Liberals. But now I just want to move on to one other thing, and that is, why don't we vote for the Ontario Party? Because this op, and it absolutely is like a textbook, I keep saying textbook, but it's an example of an actual political operation in Canada. Why is it that the Ontario Party and the New Blue Party are not the same thing? Shouldn't we be uniting together in order to stop the Ford PCs?
So we've gone over this before on our website and in various interviews, I think even with you, Wyatt. First, quickly on Vic Fideli and the Cricket Factory. Vic Fideli, for those of you who don't know, was a mayor in the North, and he was a liberal. And the only reason he ran for the PC is because the liberals didn't let him run for them. So he got mad because he wanted the liberal nomination in his riding, and the liberals turned him away. So he became a PC. So that tends to be the case for all the PC MPPs. They become PCers because they get rejected by the liberals. The other thing is, when you look at those social media influencers, whether it's Ontario Proud or those types of outfits, if you're looking at a social media influencer who's looking at something like the Cricket Factory that's getting funded by government, provincially and federally, and they're only criticizing the funding that's attached to the Liberal government federally, but they're silent on the PC government, it kind of gives away who Ontario Proud is connected to, right? So Ontario Proud is not a small C conservative outlet. They're actually a big C conservative PC outfit that provides cover to the PC party and is in tight with all the PC lobbyists.
Yeah, Canada Proud still has me blocked on social media because we were calling them out in 2020 for being directly paid by the Aaron O'Toole campaign to pump him up in that leadership race and ignore people like yourself. You actually haven't mentioned it yet. You actually ran for the federal conservative leadership in 2020, and you were, in fact, in the period of the campaign you were allowed in, you were raising money faster than Aaron O'Toole and Peter MacKay, and then they got rid of you. You won a court case against the federal conservatives. But because conservative, like the parties are private clubs, when you were brought back in, the judge just basically said you just have to kick him out this way, then it's okay.
No, the judge never said that, but the judge said he's back on the ballot. The judge said he's back on the ballot, but then they just kicked me out again in that leadership the next day. And at that point in time, the membership cutoff had expired. I couldn't sign up any more members. I was deeply in debt with legal fees and campaign fees. The Conservative Party was holding all the donor money. I couldn't pay the debt any other way because of election finance laws. And the judge did say they had to follow the book on the donor money. So they kicked me out a second time, and then it was too late to make a challenge. But I was in third place in that race, right behind Aaron O'Toole and Peter MacKay, and I was climbing really, really fast. And you mentioned Derek Sloan earlier. That was the first really grand appearance of Derek Sloan. They got him in that leadership race, and he was my stalking horse. He was the guy in that race that was teaming up with Aaron O'Toole, the Red Tory Aaron O'Toole, whose chair was Waleed Solomon. Waleed Solomon was the guy behind Patrick Brown. When Derek Sloan supposedly made the ballot and raised the $300,000, I raised all that money through grassroots donations. Waleed Solomon was quick to get on Twitter and congratulate Derek Sloan because there was a deal between the O'Toole camp and the Sloan camp. And the deal was Derek running this leadership, copy everything Jim Karahalios says, so that when Jim Karahalios gets kicked out of the race, Derek, you make sure as many of his supporters as possible don't leave the Conservative Party and put Aaron O'Toole down on the ballot in order to beat Peter MacKay. And that's why Derek didn't say anything critical of Aaron O'Toole in that whole leadership. And that's Derek Sloan's claim to fame. And then that leadership was over, and they got rid of Derek Sloan. And I thought that would be the end of Derek Sloan, but ever since then, he's obsessed with me. This guy is obsessed with me, and anything I do in politics, he seems to want to copy. So it started in 2022. He went to Alberta to create a fake party, and then he came back to Ontario, and he was doing nothing. And on the last minute, he decided to create an alternative to the New Blue. Not an alternative to the PCs, an alternative to the New Blue. And he did it with the operatives behind the back that were working to help the PCs and attack the New Blue Party behind the scenes. And the defamation that came from various sources across Ontario on my character, some of it even from pastors across Ontario, is despicable because they're cowards, because they don't have the courage to say it to my face or publicly. And they put up a challenge at the last minute. And, in some ways it worked, Wyatt, because we got 127,000 votes in that election, the New Blue. But Derek was able to run like 60, 70 candidates and suppress some of our vote, because a lot of people thought there was a Randy Hillier party, there was a Derek Sloan party, and there was the New Blue, and the vote was split. The vote was never split, but it kept a lot of people at home, and it kept a lot of people from voting New Blue. Now, fast forward, 2 years go by, Ontario Party gets deregistered, Rick Nichols, the coward, ran away. He's done with provincial politics after voting in favor of critical race theory. Derek Sloan hasn't written an email or done a tweet about Doug Ford in 2 years. And lo and behold, as soon as we announced that we're past 60 candidates or 70 and we're on the way to getting over 100, he comes up with Randy Hillier, and they say they're starting another party, and Tom Marazzo. And the irony of the whole thing is Randy's not running in the election. Tom Marazzo's not running. So they just went and signed up 30 candidates. I think they've got 30 candidates on the ballot.
It was like 44 or something, but
no, I think it was low 40s, but
I think I saw the official thing. It's like 44 candidates, but
and only about a dozen of them, are actually doing anything. The rest of them are just there to fill the paper. And at the last second, again, the same thing, just to kind of give the impression that we're not working with anyone. Look, this time around, they're a non-factor. They don't work very hard. They're lazy. And that's what you get when you get counterfeits. When you get a guy whose entire purpose in politics is to copy and be my stalking horse, and who's obsessed, like he's in love with me. This guy is in love with me, yeah. And it's disturbing me that I have this guy who won't leave me alone, but that's his job, right? Like my job, Wyatt, is I'm a lawyer and I have clients, right? I go to court. That's how I feed my family. And the New Blue is not my primary job, right? Because I have to feed my family. My wife's not an MPP. Derek Sloan doesn't have a job. So how does he feed his family? How does this guy feed his family? His number one job is stalking me in politics and making sure that the New Blue Party doesn't get ahead. And he's back at it. And he fools some people. It's unfortunate because he has some wicked pastors. One of them, there was one, his campaign manager of the Ontario Party in the last election was taking kickbacks, was out there trying to get young students that were working on campaigns to give them kickbacks to do web work and other type of creative work for candidates. And they were out ripping people off. But unfortunately, because he has some wicked pastors and shady pastors in the back supporting him, they're able to get some people to run for them. And it's sad. Because eventually those people wake up and they realize what's going on and they're going to feel bad about it. But, you know, I've warned people enough and I've taken a lot of abuse for it. So if people want to keep doing that, Wyatt, I can't stop them. Right?
Yeah. And I just want to talk about it a little bit, just to not to rehash it too much. But there's so many people who will say, well, what about this option? And it's because they maybe weren't paying attention in 2022 or Derek did a good enough job in the Ontario Party in 22 to seem real. The hilarious thing, too, is Randy Hillier in 22 said there's no point in voting. What's even the purpose of voting?
Yeah,
and why is he now back 2 years later with a lesser form of the fake party? Now he's on board, but he also won't run, although it's so obnoxious.
So Randy is the ultimate, like, can't make up his mind. He's never been consistent on an issue. His claim to fame was he came up through the landowners, and the landowners helped him become an MPP, and then he turned his back on the Landowners Association. Totally knifed them in the back. He ditched them. And then he became a famous red Tory in the nice suits, the expensive suits, endorsing Christine Elliott, photo opportunities with Christine Elliott. He never got kicked out of the PC caucus for taking a principled position on policy. He didn't vote he skipped the vote on the initial COVID lockdown bill. He got kicked out because he butted heads with Dean French, because both Randy Hillier and Dean French are stubborn mules that are egomaniacs, and it's just about them. And they butted heads, and Dean French didn't want him around. But there wasn't over principle on policy. It was nothing like that. And you're right. Randy Hillier went on this campaign against COVID, and then he disappeared. He said he was starting a political party in 2021. He never got the party registered. It's not that hard. It takes 1,000 signatures. And then and you're right, he went on this like months and months long campaign of, you can't go with political parties. They're all the same. It's a waste of time to start a political party. You can't have political party. They all serve themselves. I don't know, all this nonsense. And now all of a sudden it's okay to have a political party at the last second again. You're absolutely right. So what's consistent about Randy's a fraud, right? That's the thing. But let's just cut to the chase. It doesn't matter whether you believe me about Derek and Randy or not. I mean, I have the proofs all laid out on newblueontario.com. In this election, they're running 12, 13 real candidates. They're running 40 total, 30 are paper candidates. We're running 108 candidates across Ontario in the 108 strongest ridings for the New Blue. So a vote for the Ontario Party is a total wasted vote. because after this election, they might get deregistered again. They're never going to talk about Doug Ford. Derek Sloan is never going to hold Doug Ford's feet to the fire. Tom Marazzo is going to go on another European vacation, and we're not going to see him. But it's a wasted vote. But a vote for the New Blue strengthens the New Blue Party, grows it, makes it a bigger force, so we can keep advocating and holding the PC's feet to the fire, the Liberals and the NDP, in between elections and during election campaigns.
Yeah. Well, anyways, thanks for coming on to the show, Jim. I definitely will want you on before this election wraps up because, it's absolutely snowed in out there. So the best thing to do is more media, since Doug Ford strategically wants the checks to go out and then have the election right when people can't even hit doors as effectively. But thanks for coming on. Thanks for giving people a actual conservative option on the ballot. And I'll definitely see you next time. Make sure everyone go check out the New Blue Party of Ontario. Help out your local candidate. Do whatever you can. And I'll see you all guys all next time.
Thanks, Wyatt.